for journalists all over the world. There's been very bad and frightening stories about some journalists in their quest to get the news and publish it. Ghana has not been an exception, despite some feats chalked over the years in this field. But how bad is it outside our on our border? I'm joined on Skype by BBC Stanley Kwenda to share with us some experiences he had as a journalist in Zimbabwe. Hello, Stanley. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'm sure it's still afternoon in Accra.
It's morning in Accra, actually. It's just about getting to about 11 o'clock. So how are you marking this day, Stanley?
Well, basically, I'm remembering this day, obviously, in solidarity with my friends back home in Zimbabwe. At the moment, we don't have a desirable working environment for journalists. Back in 2010, I found myself having to leave the country simply because I had written a story which somebody within the establishment did not like. But at the moment, the biggest worry amongst Zimbabwean journalists, as well as the general public, is an attempt by the government to introduce a piece of legislation called the cybercrime legislation, which basically is trying to get people to muzzle communication online. I'm talking of things such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, social media, basically. The government is trying to control how people are communicating online. For a long time, Zimbabweans have not been able to communicate freely out in the open, and they tended to do that via these social media networks, which tended to be a safe way for them to express themselves and also to talk to the government. But now the government is trying to introduce a piece of legislation to deal with the communication online.
All right, Stanley, for those who may not be very familiar with your story, can you just share with us what you had to go through as a journalist having to flee your country and what it meant for you?
Well, basically, I wrote a story which was basically a story involving a senior police officer. His wife had committed suicide, and she left a suicide note in which she was basically detailing why she had taken her life. And when I wrote that story, he was not happy, and he came for me. The first thing he did, he told me exactly where I was. It was on a Friday night in 2010. I vividly remember that day. And he told me I was not going to last the weekend. So death threats basically forced me to flee Zimbabwe. And I had to live in South Africa for about a year until the then Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai got involved. And I got some assurances, but I always had to look behind my back when I was doing my work until, of course, I decided it was time for me to leave Zimbabwe, hence why I am also here in the United Kingdom. Thank God I'm here, I'm safe, but I think it is a big story for journalists back home, because the same problems which I faced in 2010 are the same problems which are still being faced on the ground. So that's basically the story of Zimbabwe. It's not yet there's no safe environment for journalists, if I must say.
And Zimbabwe is not the only country where journalists do not feel safe to work. But what are your thoughts on the fight so far to make it very easy for journalists to work in some parts of the African continent?
I think the best way to deal with this issue is to offer solidarity to each other, whether you're a journalist in Ghana, whether a journalist in Zimbabwe, or you are in the UK. The problems that journalists face around the world are all the same. And I think the best thing is to offer solidarity and to make this a huge united fight, which should be taken to places such as the United Nations. And I'm glad that the Secretary General of the United Nations has been also talking about press freedom. And I think there is that united front that we need to push as African journalists, as global journalists, because I think it's not just a problem in Africa, it's also a problem in the West. I think we have seen tussles between journalists in the US with the presidency. It all goes around these issues surrounding press freedom.
All right, thank you very much for sharing your story and thoughts with us. Stanley Kwenda works for the BBC, but he's sharing his story with us about how he had to flee Zimbabwe sometime in 2010 as a result of a story he wrote. Well, that'll be all for this edition of Joy News Desk. Log on to myjoyonline.com for more news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Our name is Joy News on TV. I'll be back at 12 with more news updates. Please stay with us.